Vimal Sheth, President AGFTC, and Advocate Ashutosh Thakkar, President ITBA, to escort the dignitaries, Advocate Manish Shah, Trustee, CA Mehul Thakkar, the Trustee, CA Asim Thakkar, the Trustee, and CA Sanjay Shah, the Trustee, and CA Mahesh Chahid onto the dais for this particular session. I invite all the dignitaries to kindly occupy their seats on the dais. Let us welcome our dignitaries with a huge round of applause for the Brain Trust session. I would like to introduce each trustee with a few lines. Starting with Advocate Manish Shah. The Honorable Shri Manish J. Shah sir is a successful advocate practicing in direct taxation for many years. He has successfully argued numerous complex matters against Gujarat High Court, ITAT, and against Commissioner of Income Tax. He also represented Gujarat University in All India Moot Court competition at the national level. He has contributed various articles for various journals, and he is a regular speaker at various conferences. He is also the past president of ITAT Bar Association. Let us please welcome with a huge round of applause Shri Manish Shah sir. Followed by CA Mehul Thakkar sir. Mehul Thakkar and Associates is a proprietorship firm for practicing company secretary in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, established in the year 2012 by its founder, Mr. Mehul Thakkar. He has provided legal advice and corporate secretarial services to clients for more than a year and is renowned in the area of corporate laws. We welcome you, sir. I would now take the opportunity to welcome CA Asim Thakkar sir. Honorable Shri Asim Thakkar sir is a successful chartered accountant and statutory auditor of various listed companies and other non-corporate entities. His professional experience consists of consultancy in direct taxes, Benami Properties Act, and appearance before tribunals and settlement commission. He is a former vice president of ITAT Bar Association and chairman as well as member of various committees of professional associations. Let us put our hands together for Shri Asim Thakkar sir. I would now like to introduce CA Sanjay Shah sir. Honorable Shri Sanjay Shah sir is a successful chartered accountant, and at present he is associated as a director with Deloitte Haskins & Sells, one of the 4 renowned corporate firms in the world, and looking after litigation matters. He is a past president of the reputed professional associations such as Chartered Accountants Association and ITAT Bar Association. Let us all welcome Shri Sanjay Shah sir with a huge round of applause. And finally, CA Mahesh Chahid sir, with 3 decades of experience and focused exposure, CA Mahesh sir is well known for his competence and innovation in the field of direct taxation and corporate advisory services, including M&A. He is considered as an authority on income tax. Sir's vast experience coupled with his knowledge in accountancy, economics, and tax laws is immensely appreciated by clients. He focuses on mergers and acquisitions practice of the firm while providing technical leadership to the international tax, transfer pricing, and direct tax practice of the firm. Let us put our hands together for Sri Mahesh sir. I would now invite Shri Bharat Sheth sir to extend a floral welcome to Advocate Manish sir. I now invite CA Ashish Tekwani sir to kindly come forward to welcome CA Mehul Thakkar sir. Next, I invite Advocate Ashutosh Thakkar sir to kindly come forward to welcome CA Asim Thakkar sir. I also invite Advocate Kartikeya Shah sir To kindly come forward and welcome C.A. Sanjay Shah. And finally, I invite C.A. Vishwesh Shah sir to kindly come forward and welcome C.A. Mahesh Chardin. Thank you, sir. Thank you all. I now request the dignitaries on the dais to take over the brain trust session from here on. Thank you.
The first poser is allocated to me. But before that, the president of All Gujarat Federation, Sri Bharat Bhai, the other office bearers of the federation, and my dear friends, Kartike, Mrudang, others in the audience, elders and friends. It's once again an opportunity after almost a period of more than 15 months that we are meeting over here. And so it's very, very encouraging to see a good number of people present over here in spite of the fact that we were all scared of COVID and the consequences related thereto. The fact that we are meeting after a period of almost 15 months was also evident when the learned lady read out my biodata, because it was also of the period 1 year before, because their subsequent developments were not incorporated into that one. So my latest development is from 1st July, I am no more associated with Deloitte. I am now part of Manubhai and Shah LLP as a partner looking after the tax matters. So anyway, it was in the lighter vein. You may not be knowing these things. So as I mentioned, there was no chance to communicate to you over a period of last 15 months. Now coming straight to the poser, the first one I think that must have been encountered by so many people because of the demonetization and the consequences of depositing the cash into the bank account in order to explain as to how they had deposited these amounts in the demonetization period, and which were considered as explained by the SSE, but they were considered to be unexplained income by the department, as a result of which huge additions were made in the assessment of so many people. So in the facts of this case, there are 3 deposits made in the month of November during the demonetization period. And the SSE tries to explain it with reference to his withdrawal in the earlier month, that is towards the end of October 2016, by way of 27 lakh rupees which he withdrew from one of his bank accounts. And thereafter, he deposited it into another bank account during the demonetization period, linking his deposit with this withdrawal in the earlier month, stating that the same amount I was having as a cash on hand, which I deposited during demonetization period. And that's why it should be considered as explained. He supports it with the help of the cash book that he has prepared. And in the cash book also he is able to point out that this amount was throughout lying with me as cash on hand on the date when I deposited into another bank account, and so it should be considered as explained cash deposits. The assessing officer raises the objections on 2 grounds. Basically, he says that you cannot be having this much cash on hand over a period of time, because normally I have seen that in your case, this much cash is never outstanding in your cash book over a period of last 1 year or 2 years for that matter. And that's why this seems to be something unusual. And so you must have got some unaccounted cash to be converted into regular cash during demonetization period. So I don't believe your theory that the amount which you withdrew in the month of October was still lying with you when you deposited it during the demonetization period. And second contention of the assessing officer was that when you withdrew 8 lakh rupees on 27/10, what was the need of withdrawing further 10 lakh rupees when you were to carry those cash on hand and you are not going to utilize it? So it is against the human probability that you will be having this much cash on hand so as to justify your deposit, subsequent deposit into the bank account. So this was preliminary. It's a live case which I handled recently. That's why I put it in the form of a poser. And I'm sure many of you must have encountered this kind of problem while facing the assessment relating to the year in which the demonetization took place. Now, in this regard, there are several decisions which you must note down that which supports the fact that if you are in a position to explain that you had withdrawn the cash, and in the cash book the same cash appears from day to day, and on the day of deposit the same cash was lying as cash on hand in your cash book, department cannot question you unless department comes out with some cogent evidence on the basis of which they can say that you have spent away this cash during that interregnum period. So if department does not have that evidence, then it becomes only a surmise or a conjecture on the part of the assessing officer to say that you did not have the cash on hand on the day on which it was deposited into the bank account. So those 4 or 5 cases, Gujarat High Court 176 Taxman 270, you can have Karnataka High Court 127 ITR 807, Delhi High Court 92 Taxman.com 108, Chandigarh IT80 69 Taxman.com 87, and Gurpreet Singh 67 Taxman.com 425. See, in all these cases, the common ratio is that it is for the assessing officer to establish that this cash was not available with the assessee, because otherwise it has to be presumed that if it is supported by cash book, it has to be proved, it has to be presumed that it was a correct cash book. So he is not rejecting my cash book. He doesn't have any evidence to say that I have spent away this cash. Then the logical conclusion is that what is apparent is real, unless he rebuts the same with some concrete evidence. So on the basis of these facts, I am sure that these addition should be knocked off, if not at the assessment stage, it at the appellate stage. So this is how I look at the things.
What is the address of Karnataka?
Karnataka is 127 ITR 807. All of them? Yes, okay. 176 Taxman 270, Gujarat High Court. Then 127 ITR 807, Karnataka. 807, Karnataka. 92 Taxman.com 108. 92 Taxman.com 108, Delhi. 69 Taxman.com 87, Chandigarh IT80. .com 87, Chandigarh IT80, and 67 Taxman.com 425, once again Chandigarh IT80. 61 Taxman.com 425, Chandigarh IT80. 61, last one is 61 Taxman.com 425, Chandigarh Tribunal. Now one offshoot mentioned is, would it make any difference if such cash was withdrawn before 6 months and it was continuing to reflect in your cash book as cash on hand? According to me, as I mentioned, the principle laid down is, if your cash book is not rejected, if the AO does not have any evidence that you have spent away this cash, he has to believe. You may have withdrawn for any purpose, for that matter. Unless AO comes out with some evidence that you have spent away this cash, he has to believe that whatever cash was lying in your cash book on hand, it can be deposited into your bank account. So that's all. Poser number 2, maybe.
The second query, before I go to that, I thank the organizers for allowing me to meet so many people. You know, we've almost lost touch of seeing so many people at one place. So it's very nice. It feels great to see all of you. In fact, thanks to the organizers. In fact, hats off to you that you could, manage to have so many people coming for a conference. Because I believe all of us have become so used to the e-conferences that physical conference is something where hats off to the organizers. Coming to the queries, query number 2 is given to me. I'll just read it out because it's a short query. Mr. A owns NA land, sold the same in financial year 1920 for rupees 1.21 crores. After considering indexation, long-term capital gain was 1.13 crores. in the same year, mutual funds of 20 lakhs was also sold, and there was a capital gains of 2.34 lakhs. From the consideration of both sales, Mr. A purchased residential plot of 1.16 crores and made construction of 15 lakhs. The expenditure of purchase plus construction was claimed as exempt under 54F against both sales. Consequently, no capital gains was payable on the sale of the land, but capital gains on mutual fund amounting to rupees this much was paid. Now in financial year 2021, that is the next financial year, Mr. A sold other mutual funds and got long-term capital gains. Construction of residential building is under progress. So the query seems to be revolving around the fact that, first of all, 3 years are given whereby you could be setting off your capital gains for the purposes of taking the benefit of 54F. But before I go to the questions and the replies there too, one thing very important, I believe all of us must kept in mind when we are dealing with these kind of sections is that these are beneficial sections. The government of India does not provide housing like the rest of the countries in the West do. So these are provisions whereby you could be taking advantage of the capital gains that you have earned or the sale proceeds that you have earned for the purposes of investing that money into residential purposes. These are indirect avenues whereby the government helps. And that is the reason while approaching or interpreting these sections, a broader outlook and an outlook whereby these are beneficial sections will have to be kept in mind by the courts. And if the courts are not in a position to realize that this is the principle which has to be kept in mind, we need to remind them. And for that purposes, one paragraph from an old Supreme Court decision which is very, very relevant may kindly be 196 ITR, page 188 Supreme Court, Bajaj Tempo. Now I believe a lot of you will be, realizing as to where I'm going. But importantly, the paragraph, which is in the head note, which is the second last paragraph, I'll just read out for you. It says, and which is very, very important to the present query, a provision in a taxing statute granting incentive for promoting growth and development, now kindly substituted with residence, should be construed liberally. And since a provision for promoting economic growth has to be interpreted liberally, the restriction on it has to be construed so as to advance the object of the provision and not to frustrate it. So what is the object of the provision? To give fillip to residential properties, and whereby your own money which you have made out of the sales can be going over there, and that is the reason capital gains would not be charged. Now the first part of the query is, can Mr. A claim exemption under 54F for construction done in financial year 2021 for the same residential house against the long-term capital gains arising on sale of mutual funds made during financial year 1920? Please appreciate the capital gains was in financial year 1920, where 1 lakh rupees was the tax that he had paid. Can it be set off against in the subsequent year when the construction is going on? Keeping in mind that the time frame to finish the construction is 3 years. The answer to that seems to be a yes, that you have to construe it in such a fashion that all capital gains, if invested towards the very same construction, will be eligible. More importantly, a question might arise that in the previous year, the capital gains you did not invest into the particular account, then what happens? There are conflicting views. Probably about 2 or 3 high courts have taken different views. Karnataka, Madras and Bombay have taken conflicting views. But Ahmedabad Tribunal, considering all the 3 decisions of different high courts, have taken a view that where there is a view prevalent in favor of the SSE, while there are conflicting views also against the SSE, vegetable products will be coming into play and a beneficial view has to be taken. So the view in favor of the SSE will be required to be taken. I'll just give you the citation. It is an unreported thing. ITA number 996 Ahmedabad 2014 in the case of Sanjay K. Rana. In fact, it comes from the office of Mr. Sanjay Shah now. Aarti Ben had appeared there. Where, should I repeat? It is ITA number 996 Ahmedabad 2014, Sanjay K. Rana, goes with the name of Sanjay Bhai as well. where vegetable products was taken into consideration, where vegetable products says that the view in favor of the SSE will be the one which you will be leaning towards. So that is as far as that capital gains of the previous year can be taken into consideration or not. Now comes a different facet to it. Can Mr. A claim exemption under 54F for construction done for the same residential house against long-term capital gain arising on the sale of mutual funds done during financial year 2021? Previously was the mutual funds sold in 1920. Now he sells further mutual funds in 2021. Can it be done or not? In my humble opinion, this is permissible. Once again, keeping in mind that what is it that 54F is catering to? 3 years of construction, the very same construction going on, employ the capital gains which has happened in the subsequent years also towards the construction, then it will be permissible. In fact, very similar kind of situation arose before the Delhi Tribunal. In 2017, 166 ITR, page 302, wherein the Delhi Tribunal held that this is very much permissible. There is nothing in section 54 which restricts this, 54F which restricts this, and that is the reason that restriction should not be read into the section. One paragraph from this decision would be interesting to note. It is paragraph 5.3, which is the actual paragraph of the CIT appeals order, which says, it is further observed that there is no bar in section 54F for claiming deduction second time or third time for the same property if cost of property is within the capital gain arising to the appellant. And then they go on elaborating. And the third facet of the section of the question is, if construction continues till third year, so the very same thing will come into play. If it continues in the third year, then also, because it is in that time frame, it has to be permitted. The very same Delhi Tribunal decision will be coming into play. But friends, an analogy if one has to draw, then section 54 EC also specifies about the second proviso to 55 EC also provides some clue whereby they are saying that investment within that 6 months, if more than one property is sold, but if the consideration is less than 50 lakhs, then both the properties would be, that consideration would be considered below 50 lakhs, so you'll get the benefit thereof. So they are not restricting it to more, more sales or something. Capital gains overall going towards the construction of the property within that 3 years, you'll get the benefit thereof. This is one of the kind decisions of the Delhi Tribunal. So you need to be aware about things that someone can be taking a different view. But yes, this is a favorable view. There is no conflicting view which has been taken. So you could be planning out accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, organizers of the giving me this opportunity. Issue is regarding section 151. There are a number of cases reopened, and there is a mechanical approval given by the higher authorities. So, and since 2019, it is we have never always a practice to get the certified copy of the approval pro forma from the department. They are giving either by we make the application or otherwise we are through RTI we are getting it, and they are giving us the normally they in majority of the cases I noticed that they mention approval authority, competent authority mention yes, satisfied, agreed in a simple manner. It one sample I have brought here for your reference. This, yes. So whether this approval is correct approval. Basically, the introduction of this provision was to curb the check over the arbitrariness of the assessing officer. So once they reopen the cases, in that case, they have to take the approval from the higher authorities. Higher authority has to go through the reasons recorded by the assessing officer as well as the documents relied upon him, case records, everything. Practically, just before last time when they were given this approval, the higher authority got the their request for approval by 11:55 p.m. at 31st March, and within a minute they got the approval. So this clearly shows that this is a very mechanical approval without verification of the records. And so many cases, number of cases they have put up, yes, approved, agreed this way. So there is a decision of Madhya Pradesh High Court in the case of S. Goenka, wherein court held that okay, this is a mechanical approval. Yes, agreed, this is not the approval to be considered. And in that case, reopening sanction by the authority is not valid sanction. So it same as to be treated as a not appreciated. The decision of the Madhya Pradesh High Court was challenged before the Honorable Apex Court by the department. Department SLP was dismissed. The citation for Madhya Pradesh High Court was 56 taxman.com 390 S. Goenka, and the SLP was dismissed, citation 10 taxman.com 169. In the same way, Punjab and Haryana High Court, in the case of CIT versus Atri Devi, 276 ITR 532, Delhi High Court in NC Cables, 88 taxman.com 649, again Delhi High Court in United Electricals, 258 ITR 317, Agra Tribunal, ITN number 441, 2017, Bombay Tribunal, 56 taxman.com. In all the cases, it was held that if it is not given properly, with the proper reason or appreciation of the material, then it should be considered that approval is not granted properly, so reopening is invalid. Thank you. 56 taxman.com 390, Madhya Pradesh, which was against SLP, was dismissed by 10 taxman.com 169. Punjab and Haryana High Court, CIT, Srimati versus Tridevi, 276 ITR 532. NC Cables, Delhi High Court, 88 taxman.com 649. Delhi High Court, United Electrical, 258 ITR 317. Bombay Tribunal, 56 taxman.com 199. Again Bombay Tribunal, 37 taxman.com 7.
First of all, I am thankful to the AGFTC and IT Bar Association for providing me this opportunity, at least pulling from webinar to seminar. There will be a feeling, because otherwise we have got many webinars, we did it in this last Corona period. Now I am coming to the query allotted to me. First of all, I will read that. Mr. N is an SSC who sold NA land, which is a long-term capital asset. He then constructed residential house and he claimed exemption under 54F. Return was selected for, this is very important, limited scrutiny. And the notice was issued accordingly under 143(2). And the purposes or the issues identified for limited scrutinies were very clear, that sale of property mismatch. There was a mismatch in capital gain on sale of land or building. Deduction claim under the head capital gain, and there was an increase in capital. These were the 4 issues for which the case was identified. Now, during the course of assessment proceeding, SSC had made various submissions, and from these submissions, assessing officer noticed that this land is a part of co-ownership. And many of the times, they tried to change the purpose of NA. And that's why the assessing officer straight away treated these as a business receipt instead of capital gain. And once it is a business receipt, but natural that exemption under 54F will be taken away. So he had withdrawn the benefit of 54F. Now the issue is whether assessing officer is justified in changing the head of income from capital gain to business gain when issue is not in the scope of limited scrutiny. First of all, unfortunately, I couldn't carry the citation with me, so I will not be able to give it. But the issue revolve right now is this matter also. I appeared before the Honorable ITT Ahmedabad bench, and there are number of judgments on limited scrutiny almost across the country, around 7-8 tribunals, starting from Pune, Mumbai on ITT. There are many, all ITTs almost agreed that whenever the case is selected for limited scrutiny, then it is the duty of assessing officer to restrict the scope of inquiry up to the limited scrutiny. And if you look at that, there are many CBDT circulars, starting from even beyond 2000, before 2010. But if you look at the present law, whatever right now under section 143(2) is there, starting from 2010, every year there is one CBDT circular defining the scope of limited scrutiny. And in every circular, they have clarified that assessing officer has to restrict the scope. He cannot inquire beyond whatever the issue selected, number one. Number two, if you would like to really enlarge the scope, then in that case, he has to take a permission of higher authority. And they have given monetary limit also. For Ahmedabad, it is more than 10 lakh rupee, at least as kept income. And if we look at the latest circular of, I think, 2019, in that the requirement on the part of assessing officer before seeking permission from the higher authority is similar to section 147. That means he has to record the reason, he has to convince his higher authority that this is a fit case for enlarge the scope of scrutiny. Not only that, it is the duty of the assessing officer to inform to the taxpayer that now I am converting this from limited scrutiny to complete scrutiny. If this is not being done, then this is a clear violation of circular issued by the CBDT, and we know that circular issued by the CBDT are under section 119 and they are binding on the department. So in the event of non-adhering to the requirement of circular, this is a jurisdictional issue, then all Honorable ITT are taking a clear view that assessing officer has traveled beyond his jurisdiction. Even very interesting circular of 2017 is also there. In that, CBDT had clearly written that there are many instances being observed by the CBDT traveling beyond the scope. And in that situation, CBDT had mentioned that in one of the cases we have suspended one officer. Therefore, CBDT had warned that these kind of instances should not be repeated and care should be taken. So I think in this case, the action taken by assessing officer enlarging the scope without taking permission is not valid. If you would have taken permission, then yes, he can do that. Thank you.
At the outset, I'm very thankful to AGFT and Income Tax Bar Association for inviting me to be a trustee on this brain trust session. The first question which is allotted to me is, the SSC has filed the return of income wherein long-term capital loss of rupees 10 lakh has been carried forward from earlier years. During the year under consideration, the SSC had disposed of assets on which depreciation was claimed, resulting in a deemed short-term capital gain under section 50 of the Act. The SSC seeks to set off the brought forward long-term capital loss against deemed short-term capital gain on account of sale of depreciable asset while filing the return of income, whether it is legally permissible. Now, let us understand what section 50 says. Section 50 says that there will be a deemed short-term capital gain in case of two eventualities. One, where the block of asset ceases to exist, and secondly, where the written down value of the block of asset has become zero. So for instance, as we all know, that block of asset would be a clubbing of all those assets which have a common set of rate of depreciation. So there are three buildings, A, B, C, 50,000 each. One building is sold off for say 2 lakh rupees. Your block is reduced to nil. Stands reduced to nil. So whatever is the sale price would be your deemed short-term capital gain, and accordingly you will have to pay your taxes. Section 74 provides that in case of a carry forward of a capital loss, you can carry forward, long-term capital loss can be carried forward for 8 subsequent years and can be set off only against long-term capital gains. short-term capital loss can be carried forward, but it can be set off against long-term capital gains in the subsequent years. This is the marked difference. So the issue is that if there is a long-term capital loss of the earlier years, whether it can be set off against a deemed short-term capital gain of the current year. The answer is yes, it can be. What has been held is that what you need to look into, section 50 is only a deeming section, and it is only for that limited purpose of calculation of capital gain under section 50. It does not apply to section 74. So therefore, if there is a long-term capital loss, you can set it off against your current section 50 short-term capital gains. In section 50, what is to be seen is what is the rate and how it is to be treated as capital gain. It cannot touch the classification of the asset, whether it is long-term or short-term. And this is the view which has been canvassed in the case of CIT versus Parry Eastern Private Limited, 384 ITR, 264 Mumbai, and Manali Investments, 219 Taxman, 213 Mumbai Magazine. 384 ITR, 264. And second citation is 219 Taxman, 213. Now, if we can extend this analogy further, suppose I have sold a depreciable asset which has resulted in a short-term capital gain deemed under section 50. Whether can I take benefit of an investment by making an investment which is covered by section 54 EC? I make an investment in bonds and I claim an investment. If that asset which has been sold and which has been deemed to be a capital gain under section 15 is a long-term capital asset, yes, you will be permissible. And this was actually the base judgment. Ace Builders, from Ace Builders, 281 ITR, 210. So from this, the principle emanated that no, what you have to only look into it is that asset classification is not governed by section 50. Asset classification is independent on its own. Thank you.
The sixth poser is relatable to two sections which come into play because of the facts of the case. It says that Mr. X, a partner in the firm called ABC Construction, he along with other three co-partners who are also co-owners with his owning a land, transfer their land to the firm as their capital contribution. So the land of rupees 2 crore which is recorded in the books of the firm and 50 lakh rupees each are credited to the partner's capital account because they put the value of 2 crore rupees to the land. The assessing officer, however, adopted gentry value. Remember, this is not the assessment done by the stamp value authorities. He adopts the gentry value. On the basis of that gentry value, he calculated that it should be 3 crore rupees land value, and accordingly, 75 lakh rupees should be considered to be a consideration received by each of the partners. And he taxes them considering 75 lakh rupees as the full value of the consideration received by the partners. So the question is whether assessing officer is justified in doing so. See, if you read provisions of the first part of the query, when the partner introduces his capital, there is a specific provision in section 45(3) that whenever a partner introduces his asset into the firm, then the amount recorded in the books of the firm would be considered to be the full value of consideration received by him, and accordingly, the amount of capital gain would be computed. So that's an independent section 45(3) which deals with this kind of situation. Section 50C deals with the situation where you transfer either land or building or both to somebody, and the stamp duty authority's valuation is more than the value that you have shown in your document of transfer, then that value can replace the apparent value which is mentioned in the agreement, and accordingly your capital gain can come to be computed. So there is a conflict between 45(3) and section 50C. Which one would prevail? The question would be, if you read both the sections, there is no obstante clause. They are not overriding any provisions of the Act. So they are just simply mentioned that in this situation, this would be considered to be the full value of consideration. 50C also doesn't override section 45(3). Then the general principle would be that if there is a specific provision dealing with a specific situation, then general provision has to yield to the specific provision. 45(3) is a specific provision dealing with a situation where partner brings his asset into the firm, then whatever amount is recorded in the books of the firm, that has to be considered final. In that case, provisions of section 50C cannot apply because they are general provisions. They are not specific to a situation. So 45(3) will prevail in this kind of situation, and 50C will not be available to the department to be invoked for the purpose of calculating the capital gain on the basis of rupees 3 crore rupees of the value. In that particular exact citation is not there, but then there are other sections which have been considered by dealing with 50C. You can consider the Calcutta Tribunal in the case of 114taxman.com 610 Everready Industries Limited, where it was a question of whether 43(6) read with 41(4) will apply or section 50C will apply. It was a case where SSE had sold fixed assets of his tea packet factory, and since SSE's transaction involving sale of factory building being depreciable asset was governed by specific provisions of section 43(6), read with section 41(4), valuation of property sold by SSE could not be done as per provisions of section 50C. So whenever there was a specific provision in the Act, you have to go by that specific provision. One more thing over here is the assessing officer has not gone by stamp duty valuation, because probably it may not go to the stamp valuation authorities because the partners would be holding the land in their own name. In the partnership, they have introduced this as a capital, but they may not get it transferred to the name of the firm. So if there is no valuation from the stamp authority valuer, then also AO cannot replace that value on the basis of his own understanding of the Jandri value. So that could also come in favor of the SSE, that as department had never gone for the stamp authority valuation. It was on his own that he applied the Jandri rate. So this is how I look at this. But that is also once again a general provision, no? It is applicable to all people. Okay. Between individual and HUF. But here he says about the partners. Firm will be not. Yeah, it is for individual and HUF only. Yeah, that's true. Sorry. (56)(10) you say, okay. Once again, here also the stamp duty value of which exceeds. I think their stamp duty value is never there. It has to be assessed, oh, is it? Or is it assessable also? Okay. It is assessable also, okay. You can, I mean, let the other queries, I will just try to address myself to this particular problem. Till that time, you can continue with the other queries.
I think the queries can be, I think when we are having tea afterwards, specific queries. No, I'm sure,
okay,
it is generally. No, I quite see what you're saying. Because it could be very interesting, to know a new facet also. So we must carry on after that also. The next query, that is serial number 7. I'll just read it out once again, about 5 or 6 lines only. Mr. A sold land for a total consideration of 1 crore on 1/4/2015. That is assessment year 16-17. Kindly mark this. Stamp duty valuation of the said land is rupees 1,09,81. The assessing officer has made an addition of rupees 9.81 lakh in the hands of the SSE by applying section 50C. So the question arises, can the above case be defended in the appellate proceedings before CIT appeals on the basis of retrospective application of proviso contained in third proviso to section 50C? Now kindly mark that percentile wise it is going beyond 5%. Now if you recollect proviso, the third proviso, whereby 5% of elasticity as far as price is concerned was introduced by a lot of representation which was made to the government that look here, there are a lot of issues which are arising and this need to be taken into consideration. An aerial jantri view cannot be universally applied to all possible kind of land. Taking this representation seriously, the government brought about this amendment of 5%. Recently, by the Finance Act 20, which is applicable from 1/4/21, they have raised this limit from 5% to 10%. So the question which is there arises because of this amendment, that can this amendment be considered to be retrospective in nature, and this from 1/4/21, which is going to be 10%, can it be applicable retrospectively to the assessment year 16-17 or not? In my humble view, this being a curative amendment will definitely come to the advantage of the SSC, because if you go to the memorandum as well as notes on clauses of the Finance Act 20, you will get a definite clue from that. Kindly take it down, because you might, because now everything has become, faceless. You will have to incorporate this in the kind of submissions that you are making. 420 ITR, statute portion 349 and 350. Whereby they do state about the fact that representation was made, and taking into consideration that representation positively, they are increasing this limit, which is an anti-avoidance provision actually. They are bringing in a window from there from 5% to 10%. And the notes on clauses to the finance bill is 420 ITR statutes, page 274. Interestingly, you might also be required to refer to certain judgments of the Supreme Court, whereby the Supreme Court recently has stated that wherever a curative amendment is brought about to do away with certain difficulties, then it is required to be considered to be retrospective in nature, because a section cannot be addressing all possible kind of situations. There might be certain difficulties in the process while implementing that section which might arise. And if a curative amendment is brought about, then that amendment is bound to apply from the very beginning when the section has come into play. I am referring to 404 ITR, 654 Supreme Court, Calcutta Export Company, where they have stated that a curative amendment is normally retrospective in nature, because it is brought about to do away with certain difficulties. Likewise over here, the increase from 5% to 10% has been brought about to do away genuine difficulties. Say for example, the shape of the land, it is into cravines. There are certain situations whereby there is slum, there is encroachment. All this is never taken into consideration by the stamp duty valuation. It's an aerial valuation, though you have a right of appeal against the valuation, but it really doesn't help most of the times. So your own valuer referring to all the difficulties versus the valuation by the government, and this is where this 10% will also come into play. But importantly, an issue might arise. All of you are aware that considering the Calcutta Export Company, the one which I gave 404 ITR 654, recently in 2020, 426 ITR 289 Chaudhary Transport is a little disturbing decision of the Supreme Court, whereby they have stated that in Calcutta Export Company, it was an amendment which was procedural in nature. And a procedural amendment which has been tweaked, that is always retrospective in nature. But if it is brought about only whereby the section is hurting you, and which is not procedural in nature, then it will not be considered to be curative, and it will not be retrospective in nature. In my respectful submission, and with greatest respect, the Supreme Court doesn't seem to have considered a plethora of decisions whereby all decisions, Allied Motors and Alom, have stated that wherever a provision is curative in nature, it is always retrospective, because when you are curing something, then the benefit has to go to the SSC. That is what. But then till this stands, this might be a hurdle which you might encounter. So in your submissions, friends, all the old decisions which are there, which are in your favor, need to be incorporated. Otherwise, this is going to be a Yorker which is going to take off your stumps. But coming to a very interesting decision recently, you might have read about it in the papers because there was a clipping. The Mumbai tribunal was facing the very similar situation, whereby this window of 5% was not helping the SSC, because there it was about 6.7% or so, which was the variation in the stamp duty valuation. The Mumbai tribunal stated, taking into consideration the memorandum as well as the notes on clauses, that this 10% which is otherwise applicable from 1/4/21 will be considered to be retrospective, and has granted that benefit via a decision which has come dated 15 January 21. And I believe it's a very interesting reading, and that is the reason one must go through it, because it's a very, very helpful, and the way it is worded, it will be very helpful as far as wherever there is this kind of a curative amendment, because they have taken into consideration the judgments of 40A, 1A and all these decisions, and laid down that this is retrospective in nature, and the benefit of that 10% has to be granted from 2003 onwards itself. Thank you so much, friends.
Proposal allotted to me is regarding the cash deposit during the demonetization period. In the number of cases, cash were deposited. Most of the argument was that this cash was out of cash sales or withdrawal from the past from the bank account or opening cash on hand. The assessing officer considered that whatever cash is deposited is a cash credit. Though SSC has furnished all the details of cash sales, cash book, bank book, cash register, sales register, purchase register, as well as the VAT returns, wherein the sales has been shown. So issue is where assessing officer has not disputed the books of accounts nor rejected any contentions argument of the SSC, and consider a deposit as a cash credit. Practically, cash credit is applicable only when any amount is taken on loan, borrowing, share capital, or introduction into capital by partners, proprietor. But any SSC has declared income, whether income can be treated as a cash credit or not. Once during the course of proceeding, SSC submit all the evidences to substantiate his claim that this is my income which I have shown, on which I have paid the tax. But in a general manner, they consider cash sales is higher compared to earlier years, your sales is higher. They have not disputed in majority of cases, assessing officer has not disputed the purchases, they have not even disputed the sales. So that amount, cash sales, which SSC has shown is considered as income as well as the cash deposit. So it amounts to double taxation. So there are a number of cases where it is held that once it is declared as income by the SSC, it cannot be treated as a cash credit. Once SSC is able to satisfy the requirement that these are the sales, it is duly reflected, even in the quantity records, it is shown outward of the stock, and purchases also, he has verified such, and substantiates his claim of genuineness of the purchases. In all the such situations, in spite of the evidence produced before the authority, and without rejecting any of the argument of the SSC, simply because you have deposited cash, it becomes your income. It is a cash credit. So, Supreme Court presently upheld the order of the Delhi High Court in the case of Principal CIT versus Montage Enterprise Private Limited, it was held that the trade amounts received by the SSE were adjusted against the sales made in subsequent years. It cannot be treated as a cash credit. It was upheld by the Supreme Court by under taxman.com 100. Even in the case of Rajasthan High Court, Arshida Choradia, it was held that cash received from customers against the delivery of the vehicles is also the cash sales income, so it can be treated as a cash credit. In all the cases, it was totally stated that when the SSS disclose the income, it cannot be treated as a cash credit. May I give the citations? Yes, first is Montes Enterprise under taxman.com 99, Delhi, which was upheld by the HLP was dismissed under taxman.com 100. Rajasthan High Court in case Ursula Choradia 298 ITR 349. 349. Allahabad High Court, Kanpur Steel Company, 32 ITR 56. Guwahati High Court in Khandelwal Construction, 227 ITR 900, wherein it is held that satisfaction must be derived from the relevant factors on the basis of the proper inquiry. The inquiry evidences an inquiry which is reasonable and just. Merely SSA has deposited cash and it is a suspicious. It does not give jurisdiction to the assessing officer to make the addition. Even Calcutta High Court in the case of Pagaria Nand Kishore Suvalalji, 15 taxman.com 203. 15, Pandar. Taxman.com. Even just last week, Delhi High Court in the case of Single Exim Private Limited, 228 2020, wherein also SEC out of the sales of 62 crores, 59 crores was made by cash. None of the purchases he had produced before the authority. In spite of it is held that once SEC has disclosed the sales as an income, question of 68 does not arise. In the case of Dilip Kumar Swamy, Rajasthan High Court 106 taxman.com 59, when it is said that bank account are verified from the cash book and all the bills produced by the SSE, it cannot be treated as a cash credit. Even old decision Lakshmi Rice Mill, 97 ITR 258. 97 ITR 258. If balance on hand or relevant date is sufficient to cover the value of the high denomination notes, subsequently demonstrated and even more, in absence of any finding that the books of account of the SSA were not genuine, the source of income is well disclosed and it cannot be to any secret profit. Devas ITIT Indore, it is stated that when the SSA has shown sales, profit has been clubbed, then cost of sales has been taxed. That is deducting gross profit from the sale price, ultimately credited to profit and loss account, and on the other hand, amount received from the above parties has also been added under section 68, which cannot be, which is not permissible. Before making any addition, assessing officer is required to conduct proper inquiry on the basis of his suspicions. You have to test legal testimony, And then he has to bring evidence to rebut the explanation furnished by the SSE. If he cannot furnish any brought on record any evidences, he cannot simply merely on the basis of surmises make the addition, consider the whatever the disclosed by the SSE as a cash credit. Supreme Court, in a very old decision, Parimicity, received is sought to be taxed as income. The burden lies upon the department to prove that it is within the taxing provision. (57) ITR 532. Ahmedabad Tribunal, in the case of Anant, 43 CCH 17, without bringing on record material to convert the expense of the SSE, the AO cannot brush aside. Unless AO rebut the explanation, it cannot reject the submission made by the SSE. The latest decision of 2020, in the case of Marico, in the ACIT versus Marico, Supreme Court held that the non-rejection of the explanation in the assessment order would amount to the assessing officer accepting the view of the SSE, thus taking a view, forming an opinion. This is the latest decision. It is unreported. Diary number 7367/2020. ACIT versus Marico Limited. What happened in this case? Assessing officer has made the addition of the profit disclosed by the SSE as well as the profit cash deposit. So that amount to double taxation. When in the most of the cases they have not rejected the books of accounts. Once it rejects the books of accounts, what will happen? Once assessing officer rejects the books of account, he cannot rely upon the books of account and he has to estimate the income. Applying the section 145(3), he has to pass the order under section 144. And he has to determine what is the best, considering what is the best income on the basis of the best judgment assessment. But on the same parallelly, he cannot go and make the addition relying on the books of accounts. Whatever the deposits are there, any disallowance of expenditure or any 48 or nothing can be made when he rejects the books of account. Before rejection, he has to specifically mention what are the issues for merely non-maintenance of the cash book, name of the suppliers, name of the purchasers, address is not given, cash sales is merely there is a cash. It does not give him jurisdiction to reject the books of accounts. Books of account can be rejected, which is specifically mentioned in the section 145(3). When not followed the method of accounting, nor is computer as with the accounting standard prescribed by the board. Unless anything is found, he cannot reject the books of account. Merely that SSE has not given the name, address, who is the purchaser, he is not identifiable. It except this rule 114B, wherein the limit is prescribed, more than 2 lakh cash, SSE has to furnish the PAN number. But if amount is less than that, in that case, SSE is not supposed to maintain the cash records of the cash customers. It was held in the Bombay High Court. R.B. Jesaram Fatehchand versus CIT 75 ITR 33. It was held The reason by the ITO for rejecting the books results shown by the SSC accounts or for not accepting the cash transaction as genuine could not be accepted as good and sufficient unless there was an obligation on the part of SSC to keep a record of the addresses of the cash customer. It could not therefore be said that the failure on his part to maintain the addresses was a suspicious circumstance giving rise to doubt about the genuineness of the transaction entered by the SSC. Same view was upheld by the Ahmedabad ITAT in the case of Nitisha Silk Mills. It cannot be said that in the case of cash sales, the SS is bound to keep record and name and address of the buyers. It is unreported 896/Ahmedabad/2011. Then the issue is, can he make the addition under section 69A? 69A is when transaction is recorded in the books of accounts, so question of application of the 69 would not arise. It is arise when it is not recorded in the books of accounts. Once it is recorded in the books of accounts, the question does not arise. Thank you.
Now, next issue under consideration is SSC is a civil contractor. I'll just read it briefly. And he opted for 44 AD. He declared profit rupees 3 lakh and the gross receipts were around 38 lakh. So he declared almost 8%, more than 8%. Assessing officer on the basis of this figure inferred that SSC has incurred expenditure to the tune of 35 lakh because you are reporting gross receipt 38 lakh. And you are filing return of rupees 3 lakh, so it is generally inferred that he had incurred expenditure of 35 lakh. During scrutiny, he called for the details along with documentary evidences. Now, SSC was sure enough and he filed a cash flow statement of rupees 18 lakh, where he said that I have incurred this expenditure in cash. And he also pointed out bank statement, where he had shown that I have incurred expenditure to the tune of 15 lakh rupee. Therefore, 18 plus 15, it is 33 lakh rupee yet. I think there will be some total error on my part. But he established that 18 lakh is in cash and remaining through bank. But he had not filed a single documentary evidence. Under 44 AD, he had filed the return. Because no documentary evidences were filed to prove the payment, assessing officer says that I will make an addition of 35 lakh under section 69C of the Act. Now, we are aware that 44 AD is a presumptive taxation. Now, general misconception is that of 8%, that I should really save tax of my client. I should not ask my client that what actually he is earning. So normally we prefer that 8% is written, therefore we should stick ourselves to 8%, and now all digitization, they reduced from 8% to 6%, subject to certain realization on or before filing return of income. So interestingly, if you look at 44 AD, 44 AD says that if your client is earning more than 8%, then it is the utmost duty of the client as well as on our part to report that higher income. That is what written under the 44 D. But normally we stick up to what? 8%. So here issue is assessing officer had not questioned all that part of 8%. Assessing officer had taken negative view that 8% you are declaring profit, meaning thereby 92% expenditure is incurred. Therefore, you justify with documentary evidences. Now, this issue, again, I am sorry for the citation, I will share with the Karthik or the bar member. Now, the issue was before the ITAT. ITAT had gone through section 69C, and I am just reading the opening wordings of section 69C. It says that where in any financial year, SSC has incurred any expenditure, and he offers no explanation about the source of expenditure or part thereof, or explanation if any offered by him is not, in the opinion of assessing officer, is satisfactory, then amount covered by such expenditure or part thereof, as the case may be, deemed to be the income of the SSC for that financial year, for such financial year. Now, interestingly, the first wordings are SSC has incurred expenditure. Therefore, section 69C comes into play only when SSC has incurred expenditure. Now, Honorable ITAT, while interpreting this, they said that we are under 44 AD. Here we are estimating income. When we are estimating income, we cannot take it that SSC has incurred 92% expenditure, because 69C requires positive act of incurring expenditure, while 4480 gives a complete, we can say, benefit to the taxpayer that don't maintain books of accounts documents, simply offer 8% and you will be free from other responsibility of the entire head business profession. All deduction under section 30238 deemed to have been allowed. So there is no need to keep any documentary evidence. Therefore, ITAT, Honorable ITAT, while interpreting, said that 69C requires positive act of incurring expenditure. You cannot infer that positive act when SSC has opted for 44AD. So in that event, assessing officer cannot make any addition. Even boldly we can say he cannot call for this kind of documentary evidence as well. But if he will call for, no need to exactly match. You try your level best by giving cash flow and bank statement that these are the expenditure I can gather it. But here in this case, interestingly, they have matched the expenditure exactly. Whatever bank statement they have worked out, and cash they have exactly worked out. I think last figure was something 18,30,204 kind of thing. So this should not be done. You should give a gross idea about the expenditure incurred. But courts are very clear, or sorry, Honorable ITAT is very clear that 69C cannot be invoked in this situation. Thank you.
Personal expenditure are debited.
Sorry?
If personal expenditure are debited to profit and loss account.
But this is a case of 44AD, sir. The personal expenditure would not come into picture. 44AD simply is a presumptive taxation.
So nothing to be seen.
The personal expenditure will not come into play here. You are not required to even, ideally he can call for the details, and we have to technically comply with the requirements that these are the gross expenditure I have incurred. I have not kept the document in view of the privilege conferred under 44AD.
The next question is on Binami properties. An ex-NRI has remitted funds to a builder stationed in India. He has booked a flat in the name of his father. A notice has been received from the BPU as to why the same should not be considered as Binami property and duly forfeited, whether the action of the BPU is justified. Now, as per section 2(9) of the Binami Act, a Binami property is one where there is a transfer of a property for a consideration, and that transfer does not, the consideration does not flow from the transferee, but from some other person. And that other person is holding this property for the benefit of that person who has given the transaction, who has given the consideration. So for instance, there is a person X, there is a person Y. I want to buy an agricultural land. I am not an agriculturist. So I will tell Y, who is an agriculturist, that I'll buy the land in your name. I will give the consideration and you hold on to the property. So X would be the Binami, Y, I am the person who is giving the consideration, would be the beneficial owner, and that agricultural land in question would be the Binami property. Now in this case, what happens is that once it is declared as a Binami property, the provisions have now become very stringent and strict. The property in question under the former act was that it would vest with the Binami. Now it will vest with the government. The government will take over the property. The Binami BPU unit has also become hyperactive. It has got more teeth and has got more venom than probably right now the income tax department also. Because you stand to lose everything. Once you are put into the Binami bracket, you lose the property along with all the obligations which arise. So if this is a kind of a transaction, it falls into the net of Binami. Now there are 5 exceptions. The first exception is that wherein HUF has purchased a property either in the name of the Karta or any of the member of the HUF, then same would not be falling within the Binami net, provided that the payment made by the HUF is from known sources. That is first exception. The second exception is that if the property is held by a person in a fiduciary capacity. So for instance, if the property is purchased in the name of a partner and the firm has paid the money, or a director and company has paid the money, or the trustee and the trust has paid the money, these kind of transactions are again out from the tax net of Binami. The third is that the property is purchased by an individual in the name of his spouse or any of his child. whether the child may be minor, major, adopted, stepchild, that is fine. Fourth is that a property has been purchased jointly in the name of the brother, sister, or lineal ascendant or descendant, then in that case it will go out of the net of Binami. And the fifth is that in case of a section 53A transaction where there is an agreement to sell which is duly registered, consideration has been paid and the possession has been taken over, even then if the property vests in the name of the transferor, it will not fall within Binami. Now in this case, we will fall under the category that I have to purchase. In case if I purchase a property jointly, it has to be purchased. If I purchase the property in the name of my sister, brother, lineal ascendant or descendant. So lineal ascendant would constitute my father. So in this case, suppose I become very charitable and say, nahi, Papa, I'm buying you a house. I don't like you staying here in this house. I want sufficient and I'm buying you gated security, this, that, everything. The father is also a very egoistic person. I have lived all my life in my own house and I will not buy a house if it is in your name. And he says that no, you have to buy. If you have to buy, you have to buy in my name. Yes, such an innocent transaction which is actually between a blood relative will fall within the net of Binami. Because in case of a lineal ascendant or a descendant or a sibling, the joint name of the person who is remitting the consideration has to be there. You cannot buy a house in such or any such property on an individual basis, and so therefore one has to be very careful while advising, and please look into these provisions before, because these are very innocent transactions which can happen on a day-to-day basis, which may put you in a lot of trouble later on. Thank you.
Before I take up portion number 11, just to address Ashok's query in relation to the earlier one, whether 56(2)(10) would apply. Prima facie, it appears it can apply, but I can give you two things due to which we can argue or have put up a defense. Because if you read section 56(2)(10), it says where any person receives from any person. Now, as such, under the Income Tax Act, firm and partners are different persons. But when you apply these provisions, whether when a partner introduces his asset into the firm, whether it can be considered to be a receipt in the hands of the firm, so as to apply the provisions of section 56(2)(10, that is the first one. Because partnership is a compendious name of the partners. Otherwise, it doesn't have any separate identity under the general law of the partnership. So that's there. But suppose somebody says that because they are two assets separately, department can very well take a stand that they are two different identities for the entities for the purpose of taxing provisions under the Income Tax Act. Then you have to consider the provisions of section 55(4). Now suppose in this present example, I introduce 2 crore rupees as my land on say day 1, and on day 7 I am dissolving the firm. Now what happens on that day? The firm will, if you consider that firm has received 1 crore rupees benefit, then it's paying tax on 56(2)(10) on 1 crore rupees under 56(2)(10). Then on 45(4) also, it pays tax on 1 crore rupees again. Because then whatever is the full value of consideration considered, that has to be considered in the hands of the firm, from which the cost of the asset has to be deducted. Now how do you consider that 1 crore rupees which has been paid earlier? It doesn't add to your cost of acquisition in the hands of the firm. So I think if you contrast 45(4) read with 56(2)(10), then it gives credence to my first argument that it envisages that this cannot be considered to be a receipt in the hands of the firm. This is how I deal with this, put up a defense. I do not know how far it will go, but this is a defense available to the assessee. And that can be considered in the light of the reading of section 45(4) vis-a-vis 56(2)(10). Now coming to the question of education cess, I think it was a raging controversy, and more or less after the decision of Bombay High Court in Sesagova's case, people are claiming this amount as a deductible expenditure. Because in some of the cases, mainly in the case of companies which are paying huge amount of tax, it's a big amount, and they feel that because now there are two High Court decisions, we can safely take a recourse to the ratio of these decisions that education says is an allowable deduction while computing your business income. The first decision in this case was Rajasthan High Court in the case of Chambal Fertilizer and Chemical, 107 taxman.com 484. But then, as it was a decision by Honorable Sri Kalpesh Bhai Javeri, he doesn't give much reasoning to his thinking in the form of his judgment. It was only a 4 or 5 line judgment that because of the CBDT circular, I think CBDT circular of 18th May 1967, that education cess is never considered to be a tax or a rate which has been envisaged under section 48(2). And because it stands on a different footing, and particularly the CBDT circular says that it is neither a tax nor a rate, then it has to be considered as an allowable deduction while computing the business income. So he left it at that. But then Sesa Goa in Bombay High Court in 117 taxman.com 96, they referred to Chambal Fertilizer and then also gave quite a detailed reasoning as to why they believe that education cess should be an allowable business expenditure. So it's a quite elaborate discussion that they have made, and they also relied on the board circular of 18th May 1967. They have also considered the position that cess is considered to be otherwise a tax. So whether it should be considered to be a sort of income tax, and whether on that ground 48(2) would prohibit the deduction of such expenditure or not. They have dealt with that situation also on the basis of a decision of Supreme Court in the case of excise. They have distinguished that decision that in excise there was a different situation and it should not be considered to be a part of tax. However, some of the authors, I have read the article subsequently, they still apprehend because the cess is levied by the Finance Act, and Finance Act they have mentioned that education cess is considered to be an additional surcharge. And if you consider this as an additional surcharge, it would be akin to tax, and that's why it should not be considered as available under section 48(2). But I think because of the circular of the board and 2 High Court decisions in favor of the SSE, at least one can avoid the penalty and take a chance that this amount is deductible, particularly when you are paying corporate entities, when they are paying taxes worth 100 crores, 200 crore rupees, their surcharge could be running into 6-7 crore rupees. And if that amount is available to them, they could be saving at least 30% of that amount. So it's a big, it's a sort of attraction for them to claim this as a business expenditure. The question would be in which year you can claim it. Because this, once you consider this as a cess or an allowable expenditure, provisions of section 43B will apply. Now provisions of 43B will say that it is allowable in the year of payment. Now normally, whenever we file our return of income, either we have paid by way of advance tax or we have paid by way of self-assessment tax. So that tax by way of advance tax or self-assessment tax would have been paid before the due date of filing return of income. So I think that should be allowable in the year for which you are calculating the cess, and that should be considered. You have to reverse it, you have to make the reverse calculation, because education cess would be allowable as deduction. And once again, when you compute the tax liability, you have to compute the tax liability after deducting the cess. So you have to apply that formula of 100 to 105, what would be the amount of education cess. But I think it is a worth taking chance, because thereafter subsequent tribunals, including our Ahmedabad tribunal, in the case of Jindal Worldwide, it is not reported decision, but ITA number 2316/A/2018 of 24/11/2020. They have considered, in principle it is allowable, for calculation purpose they restored it to the file of AO. Then Kolkata Tribunal, in the case of Century Plyboards, 123 taxman.com 256, and host of other decisions which has been referred to in Sesa Goa's case. You can refer to in the Bombay High Court decision of Sesa Goa, there are a lot of decisions they have given. So I think it is safe to, at present, particularly when it is backed up by the circular of CBDT, to claim this as an allowable business expenditure. But remember, It is allowable only from business expenditure, not from other sources of income. So this is how I look at it.
Friends, the next query is allotted to me, which is at 12. But before I begin, I've been told by Karthikeya that we'll have to fast forward our whatever we want to share with you so that we are in a position to complete, because the next session starts at 5:30. That's what I've been told. So pardon me if I'm a little quick, but I will try my level best to see that whatever I have done as a homework is conveyed to the gathering over here. Now, the query seems to be about a fixed deposit put by the SSC, and then the SSC is approached by someone that if you are in a position to invest a particular amount in the business, it's a very good, interesting business proposition and a lot of profit can be made. The SSC considers this to be a good proposal and wants to invest, but all his monies are in FD. So the FD is running into around 5 crores. He did not want to break it because this was immediately after he had put the FD. He would have been losing on a lot of interest or so. So what he did was he took an OD on the FD, and the question is, at the year end, he earns 30 lakhs on the FD while he incurs an expenditure of around 28 lakhs for the purpose of taking an OD facility and using the OD facility. Now, can this be taken as a deduction against section under 57 or not? Frankly speaking, to make it short, there is a direct decision per the Agra tribunal, and then I will tell you exactly how they have gone about it, because I believe they have tweaked the language and converted it into falling into that language, and that is how they have delivered in favor of the SSC. The tribunal decision is 2014 47taxman.com 88 Agra Tribunal, Rajkumari Agarwal, whereby they have stated that where the OD was availed to save and preserve the source of earning from FD. Now this is interesting, because otherwise I would have made interest over there. I am trying to save that source of making that money, and therefore the interest expenditure should be considered as wholly and exclusively, and that is how they have brought it to the language of 57 by saying that if I have tried to preserve the source of making my money, then it is wholly and exclusively for the earning of interest, and that is how it is required to be set off under section 57. Now this is as far as the decision is concerned, but I believe you might encounter a Supreme Court decision in 248 ITR 449 Supreme Court in the case of CIT versus Dr. VP Gopinathan. But bear in mind, how will you be in a position to distinguish this? In the judgment itself, there is about 2 or 3 lines which is devoted to the fact that 57 was not even an issue before the Supreme Court, nor was it ever canvassed at the lower stage. And that is the reason, though there interest was received and interest was paid on the OD taken on an FD and was required to be set off, which was not permitted, it was never the case which was there before the tribunal. And that is the reason this makes it an interesting reading as well as an interesting offshoot as to how this can be set off under 57. Thank you so much. Friends, another thing. In this year in the query, the business had not commenced. Supposing the business commences and there is a profit or a loss for that matter, the partners are going to get remuneration. I believe that is going to be taxed under 28 as business income. In the later years, you will be in a position to canvass 3613 or 37, that this can be given as a set off instead of 57. So more and more sections will be coming into play. Thank you.
Now the next issue under discussion is a company is carrying on business activity as a developer and a builder. They claim some amount paid by a regularization fee for the deviation made while constructing a structure and for violating the plan sanction in terms of building bylaws approved by the municipal authorities. A question may arise that whether this kind of regularization fee is allowable as reduction under section 37(1) of the Income Tax Act or not. Now this is normally a claim from the client that this is regularization fee. it should be fully allowable. But if you look at that, regulation is for deviation made while constructing structure and for violating the plan sanctioned by the municipal authority. So view taken by Karnataka High Court on that, I am reading the explanation 1. It says that it is declared by it is hereby declared that any expenditure incurred by the SSC for any purpose, which is an offence or which is prohibited by a law, then it is not be deemed to be have been incurred for the purpose of business or profession, and no deduction or allowance thereof shall be made in respect of such expenditure. So here there are many judgments that if this kind of violation is there, and if it is an offence or it is prohibited by law, and if for regularizing that violation, if any payment is being made, then that would not be allowable as deduction in view of explanation 1 to section 37(1). Thank you.
The next question is that why has inherited assets and liabilities on his father's death? Some overdraft had been taken by the father for the repayment of his tax liabilities by pledging shares with the bank, and on such overdraft, interest was paid by the SSE. Y is receiving dividend income and shares pledged. Can Y claim deduction on interest on bank overdraft facilities from dividend on account of overriding charges? Now, there is a very thin line dividing between what is diversion by overriding title and application of income. In diversion of income, it means that whatever is the income which is received by an SSE or a person, it is received by a person other than the person who is actually entitled to receive. That person will thereafter transfer that income to the other person who is entitled to it by a pre-existing right and title over that property. The person who receives it on behalf of the others will not be required to pay taxes, and the person to whom it has been diverted will be required to pay taxes. In short and in simplistic terms, this is the law. So for instance, if Sanjay Bhai and myself, we both have co-authored a book, we sell it to a publisher. The publisher gives me 50,000 rupees and I share that with Sanjay Bhai. That would be a diversion by overriding title. In application of money, the money is received by the person who is actually entitled to it, and thereafter he uses that money. So that is an application of money. In the first instance, where I am entitled to the income, where somebody else is entitled to the income and I receive it and I transfer it, I shall not be liable to pay those taxes to the extent to which the income belongs to the third party. In case of an application of money, I am myself entitled to the income, and so therefore I shall be liable to pay the taxes unless I make an application which is expressly deductible. So this being the fine line of distinction, in this case, yes, the no deduction would be allowed because this is not a diversion by overriding title. Had the property in question, for instance, here the issue was that I have taken the overdraft had been taken by the father to pay off his income tax liabilities. Had that overdraft been taken for the purchase of shares, and if the shares had devolved upon the son, then yes, he would have got the benefit and the deduction would have been granted. The net income would be the only income which he would have been entitled, because what you are inheriting is both assets as well as liabilities. And the entire principle and the ratio has been laid down in two Supreme Court decisions, CIT versus Uday and Chinubhai, 222 ITR 456, and CIT versus Mathubhai Patel, 238 ITR 403. Both are Supreme Court decisions.
Next question is about, once again, presumptive taxation, where the firm is covered under the presumptive taxation under section 44AD, and the partner receives the remuneration and interest, but he also claims presumptive taxation benefit under section 44AD because that is less than the threshold limit laid down in section 44AD, and he believes that because my interest or remuneration, whatever I derive from the firm, it is considered as a business income under section 28 clause 5, I am entitled to consider that I am doing an eligible business, I am an eligible SSE, and that's why I am eligible to get 50% deduction while computing my income under section 44AD. So I think I have known certain cases where people were claiming like this, particularly in the professional firm, that whatever partner was receiving the remuneration and the interest, they were claiming that we are entitled to get the benefit of section 44AD. Where is the specific embargo under section 44AD that we cannot claim this amount under presumptive rate of tax? now recently, Madras High Court, in the case of Anand Kumar versus ACIT, 122taxman.com, 252, they have held against the SSC. The reasoning given is that whatever you are receiving from the firm is not your direct income. It's an indirect way of receiving the income of the firm. And when the firm is entitled to 44AD, after the firm earns that income and offers the tax under presumptive tax, whatever you are deriving, it is not in respect of the business carried on by you. It is only a sort of compensation given to you by way of your share as well as the interest on the capital contributed by you. So it is not your turnover, you are not an eligible SEC, you are not doing eligible business, and that's why you are not entitled to get the benefit of presumptive tax under section 44. It is a direct decision against the SEC. So one should not venture to do that. That's the bottom line.
Friends, the next query is, Trust A has registered under 12A, has filed its return of income for assessment year 18-19 claiming exemption under 11. As the trust could not apply 85% of the gross receipts before the end of the assessment year, it has passed resolution for accumulation of funds, and as per the provisions of section so-and-so, but requisite form number 10 as prescribed under so-and-so remained to be filed due to mistake of accountant, and the same could not be filed could only be filed after furnishing of the return of income. The central processing, the CPU of the income tax while processing the return under 143A had withdrawn the exemption claimed by the Trust A under so-and-so and treated entire gross receipts of Trust A as its income, and accordingly raised the demand without giving any deduction of any expenditure incurred by the trust for its objects. Question 1. Whether the demand raised by CPC be treated as gross received as income of the trust is legal in the eyes of the law or not. Frankly speaking, to make it short, but then to an interesting thing which might arise is because CPC, I do not know whether it is a system generated thing, and that is the reason their whole focus seems to be that if this is not done, this is to be disallowed. I believe what will be required to be seen is what is the whole idea of 143.1. Like if you go to the old regime of 143.1, the old regime did state that you are talking about prima facie adjustments. Prima facie adjustments means that if there is a question which is required to be asked, which is beyond what is obvious, then a notice under 142.1 or 143.2 was mandatorily required to be given, because there are certain questions which are arising. Like over here, the gross income is being taxed, which is flying in the face of section 4 itself. If it is flying in the face of section 4 itself, which is the principal section of the Income Tax Act, how can it be that the CPC is allowed to tax the gross and not the net? Expenditure has to be allowed, so a draft order would be required to be given. You would be required to be given an opportunity. There is no question of you getting an order whereby the entire is taxed without your expenditure being allowed. This second part of the question is, and if this happens, and if they come out with an order and a demand is created, I believe the better thing, instead of an appeal being thought about, is to go in a writ directly to the High Court and get this knocked out, so that once and for all, these kind of orders, because they are system generated, and this is really happening, because I was approached for this kind of a situation which was being faced by some clients, some trusts, and most of the trusts are not, having that kind of financial strength to go on litigating, because the trustees normally believe that they are doing an honorary job. That's what it is. Most of the trusts are not moneyed. So I believe one will have to really take up a trust whereby one can go to the High Court if this thing happens and required to test it. Whether the CPC has exceeded its jurisdiction, I believe yes, it would be exceeding the jurisdiction, because it cannot be doing something which is otherwise than what the Act permits. CPC might be anything, but it is system generated. That system, if required, needs to be tweaked for implementation of the Act. Thank you.
The next discussion is on very Supreme Court judgment, ITC Limited. The issue is picked up from that. There's a company engaged in owning, operating, maintaining hotels, allowed their employees to receive tips from the customer by virtue of their employment. Tips were also collected directly by the hotel company from the customers. When the payment was made by them through credit cards, the hotel company thereafter dispersed the tips to the employees. Assessing officer treated the receipt of tips as income under the head salary in the hands of various employees and held that company was liable to deduct tax at source from such payment under section 192. And because company failed to deduct TDS on this tips part, which was considered by assessing officer as salary, and that's why assessing officer treated company as assessed in default under section 201 subsection 1. And the issue was before the Honorable Supreme Court in ITC Limited, I think it was 2016, that whether the action taken by assessing officer is tenable in the eyes of law. Now, if we look at section 192, just I will not read out the whole section, opening wordings. It says that 192 subsection 1, any person responsible for paying any income chargeable under the head salary shall at a time of payment deduct income tax. The opening wordings of the section clearly says that who is required to deduct TDS under 192? Any person responsible for paying income chargeable under the head salary. Now a question may arise that whether tips, because nowadays it's very common that tips are being paid through credit card, and that's why the entire money goes to the employer, and then employer, as per the understanding, he will share the tips among the employees. The question may arise that whether this amount received by the employee, which tips are received by the employee through employer, can be considered as an income under the head salary? If answer is yes, then definitely assessing officer is right. But if answer is no, then in that case, section 192 is not applicable, then there cannot be a question of applying 201 subsection 1. Now Supreme Court had very wonderfully interpreted this part. Supreme Court says that here employer is receiving tips in a fiduciary capacity as a trustee on behalf of employee. Actually these tips are being received by the employee from the customers. It is routed through employer. Like just Asim Bhai said, the diversion of income by overriding title. It is similarly because I am receiving in a fiduciary capacity. I am not the beneficial owner of that tips being a company. I am just holding as a trustee on behalf of my employee. If that is the case, then Supreme Court says these tips cannot be considered as income chargeable under the head salary, because here employer is not responsible. Employer is just collecting. It is customer who are giving. That's why this income would fall under the head income from other sources. And because it would fall under the head other sources, section 192 cannot be invoked. But I'll add one more thing on that part, very interestingly and very importantly, that section 192 casts one more responsibility on employer, that if employee reports other income, I repeat, if employee reports other income, then it is a duty of the employer to deduct TDS on other income as well. There are certain restrictions that losses will not be reported. If losses are being reported, they will not be considered, except the loss under the head house property. But that part of discussion was not done by the Honorable Supreme Court. The argument was not done. Actually, employer is aware that this is a tips he is sharing. He is collecting on behalf of employee and he is sharing. The employer is aware of the other income. So ideally, under other provision of the 192 itself, TDS required to be deducted. It is very commonly found in private limited case. Director remuneration is being paid, same director is being paid interest as well. So when employer is aware, then question may arise whether TDS is required to be deducted by employer. That part was not discussed before the Honorable Supreme Court in ITC Limited. So right now judgment is in our favor that this is not an income under the head salary. That's why it cannot be subject to TDS under 192. Thank you.
The next question is that in a company, a mother and daughter are the only shareholders. Mother brings in further capital at a higher premium. Whether the difference of the market price of the shares and the share price received by the company can be taxed under section 5627B. Now, 5627B provides that in case of a company in which the public is not substantially interested, it receives any sum, and for that sum should be towards the issue of shares. The aggregate consideration which has been so received as exceeds the fair market value of the shares shall be chargeable to tax. The fair market value will be determined as per the rule 11U and 11UA as may be applicable. So in this case, the company has received share, say premium or share premium, only mother and daughter are there as the shareholders. Now this issue has been taken up from a direct decision, Vani Estates Private Limited. I'll briefly tell what the facts of the case were. The husband and wife, they were both shareholders of holding 5,000 shares each. Father had expired, husband expired, and the shares devolved on the daughter. So now the mother and daughter, they became the shareholders in equal proportion. Property had to be purchased, say for 25 CR. So what the mother did was that she introduced that money from her own sources, and the shares were issued at an exorbitant premium of 23,000, 24,000 odd rupees premium per share. The property in question was purchased. The AO took the view that before the purchase of property, this amount has been received, so you can never claim that the intrinsic value of the shares had increased because of the purchase of the property. The property was never there, and so therefore 56(2)(7)(b) would clearly apply in this case. The matter traveled to the CIT decided against the SSE, and it further traveled to the tribunal. Tribunal took a view that first and foremost, these provisions have been brought in by the Finance Bill 2012, and the Finance Minister at that point of time had stated on the floor of the House while introducing the bill that these provisions are there with a view to deter the generation and the use of black money. Two, there is no case of anybody that the money which has been brought in by the mother is unaccounted. That money is clean and from explained sources. So there is no such issue arising, because as you would be well aware, that shell companies and all of them have mushroomed only till these provisions had not come into play. Exorbitant premiums for a newly laid out company were being charged and money was being brought in and introduced. So this was not a case here, that the money had come in from clean and genuine sources. Further, if the corporate veil is lifted, and suppose you in turn do not believe this to be a genuine, you lift the corporate veil, then what would effectively happen is that the money would transfer from the mother to the daughter, and in any case, that is, she is a relative, so it doesn't in any way affect. Put it in another way, if the mother had given the gift to the daughter and the daughter would have brought in money, nothing would have happened. So that is one issue that was also argued. And all these provisions, 56(2), 6, 7b and 10, all of these have to be viewed harmoniously. These should not be read so much strictly. They are in for a particular purpose, and that purpose is to deter generation of black money. And even in case of family arrangements, the corporate veil is always lifted, the share transfers are allowed, and the transaction is not subject to capital gains. So this was the view which was expressed. So in case where there is an absolutely family owned issue, then and all of them who are the shareholders are relatives within the term as defined in section 56, then there should not be much of a problem. Coming to the issue of Sanjay Bhai, in case of Sanjay Bhai, if the 4 partners had introduced land and the 4 partners were brothers, then probably you can take refuge of this decision and get away with 56(2)(10) also. A reverse in this case was also that when 56(2)(7)(c), which is when the company, you get a benefit from a company which is in excess of the fair market value. He was offered a right share, and that right share, before the right share was issued to others also, only the 2 brothers were the directors and the shareholders, exclusive shareholders. Visakhapatnam Tribunal, in the case of Y. Venakkan Chaudhary, 180 ITD 166 took a view that no, under such circumstances 56(2)(7)(b) would not apply. So Vani Estate Private Limited, 172 ITD 629 Chennai and 180 ITD 166 Visakhapatnam, both these decisions, if they are family owned and controlled, would help in circumventing the difficult provisions of 56(2). Thank you.
Thank you, Asim sir. I'm afraid that we'll be able to take, that will be the last question that will be taken for the Brain Trust session. With this, we come to the end of the Brain Trust session. We once again thank Advocate Manisha sir, CA Mehul Thakkar, CA Asim Thakkar sir, CA Sanjay sir, CA Mahesh Chayat for gracing the Brain Trust session. I would now request all the dignitaries on the dais to please come forward for the group photograph. I request CA Ashish Tekwani sir to kindly come forward and felicitate CA Mehul Thakkar sir. I request Advocate Ashutosh Thakkar sir to kindly come forward and felicitate CA Asim Thakkar sir. I request Advocate Kartikeya Shah sir to felicitate CA Sanjay Shah sir. And I request CA Vishwesh Shah sir to kindly come forward and felicitate CA Mahesh Shah sir. Thank you, sir. I request the dignitaries on the dais to kindly pose for the group photograph.